The other day, I was introduced to a pretty fascinating fantasy ecosystem called Dragonbond. It was created by a company called DRACO Studios, which has made a few other gaming universes, but Dragonbond is by far one of the more complex developed by them. Its fantasy world is fed by a variety of products. At the time of this recording, Dragonbond consists of a series of 3D printable dragon models, a 320-page adventure compendium with 7 high-level dragon quests keyed to 5e, a collection of hundreds of miniatures that you can print and paint for those adventures, a board game, which you can also print out your own pieces for and play, and another fully 3D printable war game. Also, coming up in a Kickstarter is a massive 3-book RPG that unpacks the setting in 5e rules in pretty much every conceivable way. This is the first of 3 videos in which I'll be discussing Dragonbond. In this first video, I'm going to talk about the product line a little bit and then present the lore of the world of Valerna from a bird's eye view. In the second video, I'm going to cover Great Wyrms of Drakhain, the book that contains 7 epic dragon adventures set in the Dragonbond universe. And in the third video, I'm going to preview the Endless Sagas RPG Kickstarter. So the product line that DRACO Studios has developed around Dragonbond allows you to approach the setting in a few different ways. And this is fascinating to me because I've been thinking a lot about how different types of games present value landscapes in different ways. With a board game, for example, the players value the game's victory conditions, and in Lords of Vala, those include defeating dragons. Unlike RPGs, there's no concern for storytelling or character development, but the dragons and other trappings of the Dragonbond universe are still experienced in a certain way while playing. Then there is the option of playing the war game, Battles of Valerna, in which the core goal is to defeat other players in battlefield engagements. The different fantasy races and monsters are experienced in yet a different way here, seen strictly in terms of their combat abilities, movement features, and traits related to battle. Then there's the option of just printing the models simply to paint and display them. If you've spent any time doing 3D printing at home or hanging out in printer communities, then you've discovered the fact that a lot of folks just print and paint RPG stuff for the sake of showcasing and displaying their models. The printable models from all of the Dragonbond products are pretty epic, even as standalone display relics, and the collection of them is staggering at this point. You can get some of the models from DrivethruRPG and buy them also individually from My Mini Factory, which, if you're not familiar, is one of the big online storefronts for 3D printable models. DRACO Studios has a shop on this site where there are literally hundreds of Dragonbond models at this point, and you can actually subscribe and pay a flat monthly rate to get new models as they're being released monthly. And if you don't have a printer at home, there's a place where you can just order any of these models to be printed and shipped to you. I'll leave the links below. Anyway, finally, with regard to experiencing an imagined world, there is the tabletop role-playing game, which in this case comes in the form of Great Wyrms of Drakhain and the upcoming Endless Sagas, in which the objective is really to tell a fun, possibly epic collaborative story. I think the most obvious reason that any game publisher would choose 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons as the rule set is the size of the 5e market, but I think DRACO Studios made the right decision with 5e in terms of the theme and tone of Dragonbond. The fantasy continent of Valerna is host to fantasy kingdoms that are largely antagonistic to each other, and the world is ravaged by bloodthirsty dragons every couple dozen years. This is the definition of high fantasy roleplay and the many what I might term vectors of hostility, with the dragon raids and the animosity between fantasy races just being a perfect backdrop for 5th edition D&D's focus on personal combat and heroics. So let's take a look at the setting itself. The idea is that there is a world called Rava, created in a void out of magic. On that world, there are multiple continents, but the only one that we know of for now is Valerna. Valerna spans all possible biomes, from frozen tundra to grassy plains to tropical forests, and is host to 4 major kingdoms, half a dozen medium-sized factions, and dozens of races. But before there were all those different species, at the world's inception, there were only the Protagons, these powerful immortals who made and dreamt up the various races on a whim. Their reign over the world ended when a primordial dragon named Cadmos replicated itself and waged war against the Protagons. This triggered the beginning of the end for the Protagons, and for the dragons, it ended up with them being banished to the planet's red moon called Drakhain. Okay, so there are two magical forces that course through the world. The innate magic that permeates all things called Vala, and its negative antithesis called Null. When the dragons were all banished to the red moon, their connection to Vala was severed. So from that time until present day, thousands or hundreds of thousands of years later now, the dragons have invaded Rava every 27 years to forcibly collect Vala, usually through devouring and other destructive means. The thing is about the dragons is that they're not all bad. Every so often, a mortal and a dragon will come to an understanding and form a social, spiritual bond. When this happens, the dragon and the mortal become linked and more powerful than the sum of their parts, and they're called the Dragonbonded. It was actually the Dragonbonded that put the final nail in the coffin of the Protagons. Within the largest continent of the world, Valerna, there are 4 major kingdoms. First and foremost among them is Alaria, known as the Dragon Kingdom. It is ruled by half-elves and enforce a rigid social order. It was formed in the wake of a magical cataclysm, and now one of the 3 aspects of positive magic here are banned. It's probably worth mentioning at this point that there are 3 aspects to the primal force of Vala. The first is Phi, or the dreamlike aspect of imagination and creativity. This is what the kingdom of Alaria has banished. The second is Ka'ab, the source, as it's called, which guides life and death. And the third is Id, the will, described as an aspect of power and transformation. So anyway, the kingdom of Alaria has the most disciplined armies, including elite Oathguard and specialist cavalry, and ironically, powerful combat wizards called Dream Shapers, who actually use Phi, or dream magic, which is otherwise forbidden in the kingdom. The second most powerful faction of Valerna is the Blood Empire of Tiveria, which is ruled by blood sorcerers called Magiri. They use their vampiric powers to consume and manipulate blood and gain more power with each subsequent generation. There are a couple of drawbacks to this, though. The first is that each of these blood sorcerers is stalked and harassed by dark wraiths called Kada spirits, and as they grow more powerful, so does the spirit. The other drawback is that every time a vampire or blood sorcerer drains too much blood from a donor or victim, they become a blood husk, a mindless ghoul that thirsts for blood. Blood husks are a major source of embarrassment for the ruling class of Tiveria, who are otherwise very proud of their regional dominance and powerful armies. Nahuek is the name of a coalition of free states that all participate in a harmonious existence with nature. The cities here are integrated with nature, and the people here are from the oldest lineage of humans in all of Rava. Their armies employ naturalistic themes that might be described as druidic, as well as devious necromancers called Zybak sorcerers. The Holy Alliance of Isval is the youngest realm of Valerna and is based on the only organized religion on the continent, the Temple of Light. It's organized into dukedoms, of which Isval is first and foremost, but it's the least powerful of all the realms. In a bit of a plot twist, it's believed that the holy powers of the Temple of Light originate from the Null, which is the sort of evil force in the setting. Other smaller realms include Sicaria, a magocracy ruled by mysterious, playful blue elves. The Shield clans of Ankara is a conglomerate of sky dwarves who stay aloft in dirigibles. The Scourge Triumvirate is an alliance of the Boab snakefolk, the first people of the world, the Obakar orcs, and the people called the Dejat. They're bent on taking over the continent since the Boab once ruled over all back into the Protagon days. The Fell Courts are a dreamlike realm ruled by the Fari, or Dream Elves, constructed and styled as a mystical elven forest that parodies the true heritage of the elves of the setting. Dream Elves only exist in this ethereal realm, and very few mortals are ever able to visit. Gelinor is a small sliver in the northern wastes composed of exiled knights who refused the Temple of Light, along with snow orcs, winter witches, and an army of mammoth-riding frost dwarves. And finally, the Altanese Ascendancy, the first humans to have escaped the oppression of the Boab snakefolk back in the day. For a time, they ruled over the continent themselves, but it has been untold millennia since their heyday. They plot their return to power from the Primalian Mountains. There's an entirely other realm, mostly analogous to D&D's Underdark, called the Hollow Depths. Think vast underground caves that span maybe the entire breadth of the continent. Down here, there are 9 incredibly powerful entities called the Daimoi, who have each gorged on Vala to the point that they are untouchable and basically immortal. Serving under each of them are hundreds of demigod-like incarni who take on their unique characteristics and who, let's face it, you're presumably trying to kill and loot in the RPG. Down in the underworld, there are also third-party entities like the Wada Cartel, a mob run by huge, grotesque frog-like giants who possess massive, overflowing brains and an insatiable appetite for mortal consciousnesses. The setting presents different fantasy races along largely very familiar lines. You have the dwarves, which come in different forms like sky dwarves, cave dwarves, and frost dwarves, depending on their native environment. Elves are long-lived creatures who also come in a variety of subtypes: dream elves, blue elves, and the half-elves of the dominant kingdom of Alaria. Most elves on the continent can be found working as artisans, explorers, scholars, and mighty wizards. The gnomes of Valeria come as gold gnomes, who excel at engineering and alchemy, jade gnomes, who are largely architects, and bone gnomes, who are known for their healing and medical abilities. Halflings don't have much of a culture of their own and act rather as adjuncts to a host culture. They come as 3 subtypes: the bright halflings, shadow halflings, and keen halflings, which each have their own proclivities. Orcs also come as several subtypes and range greatly in size. Humans are the most abundant people in the setting, but most of them are not so-called enhanced humans. Those who are enhanced are blessed with advanced abilities in one of the 3 aspects of Vala. Before the humans arrived on the continent, there was a huge variety of chimeric peoples. These included, and still include, beast folk, basically a selection of anthropomorphic animal folk such as oxen-like Busentari, the bear-like Utabai, and the merfolk. Occupying their own category of chimerics are the Saurians, which include all lizard-like and bird-like people. The most notable of these are the Boab snake folk, who pose a Hyperborean threat to the current civilization and the status quo. And finally, there are the Dejat, who can pretty fairly be described as elementals, creatures of pure energy that emerged in the wake of the Protagons. As the story goes, many millennia ago, the dragons of the world were all banished to the planet's red moon called Drakhain. On this moon, countless dragons divided themselves into at least 7 broods, each led by a single apex dragon leader called an Azurma. These broods each contain their own style of dragon. Brood Fulgen dragons are the most arrogant and have metallic scales. Brood Coatl dragons are feathered and intensely curious about all forms of magic. Brood Magnifex are beautifully colored and obsessed with treasures and works of art. Brood Exor worms are savage, ruthless hunters that swim in the sands of their moon world. Brood Erlia dragons are smiths and crafters, and even forge armor and weapons that mortals can use. Brood Nyx dragons are undead and look like skeletons for the most part. They steal the eggs of other broods because they're unable to reproduce on their own. And then there is Bastherox, a brood of 1. He fought Cadmos, the first dragon, and lost, but still remains the biggest, baddest dragon of them all. Okay, so my question is, does Dragonbond represent the future of RPGs? In a way, it can't be the future for smaller, independent creators because making an RPG, board game, war game, and hundreds of miniatures to accompany it all is just too much work. But at the studio level, where there is a team of writers and artists working side by side, I think it's a very compelling model. The idea of being able to explore a world from different angles with different kinds of games is fascinating. I find the combination of a war game paired with an RPG sharing the same setting to be particularly interesting, especially if the RPG being paired is something like 5e, which is generally pretty combat oriented. I think 5e's rules are best at the small skirmish level, but if players want to zoom out and conduct combat at a grander scale, the war game, in this case Battles of Valerna, can accommodate that. And the 3D printable models for virtually every kind of monster you might face is just icing on the cake. Like I mentioned earlier, this is the first of 3 videos on Dragonbond. The second will detail the Great Wyrms of Drakhain adventure supplement, and the third will preview the upcoming Kickstarter for Endless Sagas, the major sort of debut of Dragonbond as a fully fleshed RPG. I've left links for everything below. Let me know if you've backed any Dragonbond projects on Kickstarter and what your thoughts are so far. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.